Now I would like to introduce my friend, Dr. Connie Stewart. We've been friends forever. She's currently teaching at UNC. Her focus is art education and contemporary art, but she found a place in her heart for the degenerate art of the Holocaust, and we're pleased to invite her to present today to you, and I'm sure we'll all find it very interesting. So, Connie.
If I stand here, can you see me? Am I standing in the way of where you can still see the screen? Is everybody okay? I will do that.
Perfect.
And I can stand over here and I'll walk back and forth with my computer and I'm good. And can everyone hear me if I use my teacher voice? Am I good? Okay, that's great. We'll do that. Yes?
Just a reminder for everybody to turn off their cell phones.
Yeah, you can, although I'm used to teaching college, and if anybody wants to fact check me with your phones, go right ahead. I've turned my classes into kind of this group exploration of knowledge, and people will often say, but excuse me, he was actually born in. And you're more than welcome to do that. Like Nomi said, I teach art education and contemporary art. I have not researched the art of the Holocaust until Nomi asked me to speak and we started brainstorming different topics. I have been on sabbatical this semester, and this topic has really encompassed the sabbatical. I've become very, very interested in it, although you may know more than I do. And so again, just look at this as an opportunity for a group discussion and feel free to add to the conversation as I talk. I would really appreciate that. Together, we know a lot, and hopefully we can learn a lot from what happened to art. What I am interested in is art education. I'm wearing my red for ed, so for everybody that is supporting teachers in this time of activism. And as I teach art education, I'm interested in what an object means, because we make things, but what does it mean when we make things? And we start looking at objects as text, just like a word. And those words change meaning with the context. And that was one of the things I became very interested in as I was looking at art of the Holocaust, is what did these pictures mean originally? What did they mean to the people that owned them? And then what are they meaning now? And it brings up many questions, and that's the other thing I'm very interested in art education, is questions where there's right answers on both sides, and you can have a dialogue. And this whole conversation about the looted art is a question with answers on both sides. And so I hope that you leave with questions, and we can continue the dialogue at another time of what this art means, and what's right, what's wrong, what are the ethical considerations when you're looking at art. I am a little bit hesitant to look at objects when we're talking about the horror of the Holocaust, because 6 million people died, and we're looking at stuff. And how does that stuff tell the story? And do we belittle the lives of the people if we're just talking about stuff? And so I'm aware of that as I'm talking. I have an example from my own life that has nothing to do with the Holocaust, but it does have to do with loss. And while I've been on sabbatical, I've helped my mother, whose husband died in December, not my father, but her husband, and she had to move out of her house. And she lived in the house that my grandmother lived in. And anybody that had died for generations before had brought their stuff to that house. And she had been living with that stuff for many, many years, way over 20 years, that she had been living in the house with the stuff. And as we moved her, we had to pack up the stuff, and it was really, really difficult for her. And right as we were ready to leave, and I wanted to take her to a new apartment, I was pretty excited for her to see it and to start on a new life. She said, "Do I even have a coat?" Because I went, oh my gosh, there were 2 closets that I'd forgotten to go through. And I said, oh yeah, you've got 2 closets of coats. I forgot to go through that. We've got to do that. And the last time she spent in that house was going through these coats. and saying, oh, this was Elda May's, and this was Glenola's, and this was a half hour going through these coats. Well, they went to the Goodwill. You know, they probably mean nothing, but the stories that were embedded in those coats as she said goodbye to her house are going to stay with me forever. So as we look at these objects, it's in the context of the stories of the people that own them, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. During the Holocaust, it is estimated that the Nazis appropriated 1/5 of the artwork of Europe. And if you have ever traveled to, how many people have traveled to Europe and gone to the museums? There's a lot of art in Europe. And 1/5 of it was handled by the Nazis. The Nazis were very meticulous about keeping records. And so after their defeat, a lot of that art was able to be restored to its original owner, but a lot wasn't. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. These are my resources, and they're all readily available. And so if you're interested in these topics, these are all books that you may want to look at. The Lady in Gold, and then the movie was The Woman in Gold, The Rape of Europa, and there's also a documentary titled the same thing, The Rape of Europa. Treasure Hunt, and we're going to end talking about this GI that lived in Texas, and of course the Monuments Men. I also used a lot of resources that are online, newspaper articles, blog posts, that type of thing for this presentation, and I have those resources on a paper in the back. If you want to email me, I could email you the digital copy so you can just click on them, but if you'd like to do further research, this is where I got my information. So you're probably familiar with the degenerate art, Untitled Kunst, that was begun in the 20s. So when Hitler was rising to power, he started identifying the art that he considered to be degenerate. And at this point, you've got university professors that are losing their jobs and people fighting for the value of modern art. So one of the people that lost her job at this time was Kitty Kollwitz, if you're familiar with her, and that's a whole different story. But that was part of this movement of degenerate art, of what's accepted and what's not. Generally, it was modern art that was current at the time. German Expressionism, Jewish art, and Bolshevik art. So art of Russia, art that had anything to do with Jewish culture, and then current modern art. And in doing it, he was fairly astute, because I don't know that he was as interested in the art itself as he was in playing to political opinion. And I don't really have a resource for that. That's my opinion as I've looked at it, that he knew how to play popular opinion to get support. He was trying to get support for his rise to power. And people would look at the art like, and I'll go back to this, but you know, here's James Ensor. And James Ensor is doing these really shocking pieces with this very rough style, and he's doing it as a critique on society. It's supposed to be disturbing. But general populace will go, no, we need art. I know what art is, and I know what I like, and I want something that's more beautiful. And so Hitler would say, look, this museum paid so much money for this art. Isn't that awful? And people go, yeah, that's awful. And he would get support. So it was really a tool of political power. So he sees in this ability to get support for himself, and it culminates in the Degenerate Art Show in 1937. In the paintings and drawings of this chamber of horrors, there's no telling what was in the sick brains of those who wielded the brush or the pencil. And that was in the catalog. So it's a copy of the catalog. So you've got pictures like James Ensor, who is not Jewish. You also have Gauguin, which now we consider to be beautiful. So that whole idea of what's beautiful, what's not, but people would look at that and the colors are garish, and no, we didn't need to spend money for that. It is interesting to me in what's considered to be degenerate and what's not. This is from Life magazine, 1939. And this is degenerate. This is fine. And in context of the Me Too movement, I'm going like, no, that's really not okay. You know, this guy, you know, attacking this woman. But no, that was fine. That was not degenerate. That was good German art.
Is that a photo from the health movement? Anything that was going on in Germany?
You know, it's a photo from Life magazine, but I don't know.
Oh, Life magazine.
Yeah, so it was, and it was at the same time with that same question. Today, Germany forbids any work of art that does not render an object faithfully or which derides Nazi ideals as women in war, but approved is this bold statue glorifying the German urge to be funkend. So let's procreate more German babies. The actual degenerate art show drew over 1 million people. So people were and even though it was all presented haphazardly with the prices that museums had paid, across the street was a very beautiful presentation of what was accepted German art, and that drew about 1/3 the number of people. And then this travels. And that's true today too. All you have to do is have an official condemnation of an artist and he's automatically famous. But just because you're condemning something doesn't mean that you can't make some money off of it. So we hope at least to make some money from this garbage. So there were about 15,000 pieces that were identified as degenerate. There were some that were burned in this show of Nazi disdain for degenerate art. But there were a lot that were kept. And in Switzerland in 1939, there was a sale at Fischer Gallery with some of what was considered to be the most valuable works that had been taken from museums without repayment. I mean, they were just taken as degenerate. And then the Nazis decided to sell them. So there were American museums, representatives of the Met and of MoMA, that had real trepidations. Do we buy this stuff or do we not? Are we preserving it or are we supporting the Nazis by buying it? And so they were assured that the money would go to the museums that the pictures were taken from. That never happened. You know, it went straight into the Nazi coffers. One of the more interesting pieces, I think, is this one is a Matisse. And this is one where the junior publishers go like, sure, what do you know, why is that thing valuable? Well, it was. It's a Matisse, he's interested in color and shape. And so he was doing something different than trying to make a representational piece. This piece was particularly valued by the artist, by Matisse, and it was purchased at the Swiss show by Matisse's son, Pierre, and Pierre didn't have enough money for it, but he was an art dealer, and he bought it for Pulitzer. So Joseph Pulitzer ended up buying it out of the show, but it was chosen by Matisse's son as one that needed to be preserved. I don't know if those are the three graces. That would be interesting because that would be a connection of why Matisse was trying to do that, because he was trying to recontextualize classical forms. And so it makes sense, but I don't know if that was in his mind. So at the same time, you have the process of Aryanization, not just with art, but throughout businesses. Any Jewish holdings needed to be used in the service of the master race, the Aryan race. And so many people chose that time to leave. So people involved in art left, and not just in art, in many different fields. And at that point, they were coming to the US and to Canada and to Central and South America, wherever they could come. They often voluntarily sold their assets, but sometimes then it was under pressure. And then they were charged huge exit fees to be able to leave. They were not allowed to take art out of the country. And so they were not allowed to take cash out of the country, and so they would try to take art out of the country, but often that was stopped also. Bribes fueled the art trade. So here you have, I just have in my notes that there was an art collector named Robert van Hersch, and he bribed Goering with a Renaissance painting of a chronic so that he could get out. So he owned this Renaissance painting. They're bribing top Nazi officials to be able to leave with their lives. At this point in 1938, you have victims being able to keep family portraits. That ends up changing. Everything that was taken by the Gestapo was documented, and the people that owned the stuff had to sign what was called a protocol so that it was legally given to the Nazis. And that comes into play later on as these things are sold again. Were they stolen, or were they actually the legal possession of the people that then are trying to sell them later? One of the worst people was Karl Haberstock. He was a member of the Degenerate Art Disposal Commission, but what he was really doing was collecting for himself. He knew the value of these contemporary modern artists, and to the point that people started complaining about him, and Hitler stopped him. Well, if there's a moral question and Hitler comes in against you, you know, you're really in trouble. So we're going to talk about Austria, and I'm going to spend most of the time talking about Austria, and then we'll briefly talk about the rest of the world, and then a little bit about this guy in Texas. I didn't hook up speakers. This is just a 1936 video.
Vienna was world famous for its imperial splendor and gaiety. Now, as capital of the post-war Republic of Austria, it is one of the most beloved of cities by travelers. Much of its former glory is preserved in magnificent palaces, public buildings, and beautiful parks which border the Ring, a boulevard laid out on the curving site of the ramparts of Old Vienna. The State Theater in the foreground is one of the most magnificent in the world.
Just from that much, you get the idea of Vienna as a center of culture, with music and art and literature and psychology. Freud was working. So many important ideas that have influenced us were being discussed and talked about in Vienna. And along the Ring, you have extremely wealthy families that were supporting this exploration, and many of those families were Jewish. So this is one family. Maurice Bauer was the president of the Oriental Railroad, so the Oriental Express. And he was one of the families, very, very wealthy, that was supporting new innovations in the arts and in culture. And he had two daughters, Therese and Adela. And then Therese married Gustav Bloch, and Adele married his brother, Ferdinand Bloch. They had 4 sons, and all of those sons died in different ways fairly young. And at that point, the daughters took the name Bloch-Bauer to preserve the family name. And so the family becomes known as the Bloch-Bauers. And then Therese and Gustav had Louise, Maria, Carl Charles, Robert and Leopold both took the name Bentley when they escaped from the Nazis. And as you know, Lady in Gold has to do with Adela. So Adela is the younger sister. She is seen here, and this is from the book, The Lady in Gold, as reciting a poem as a personification of spring. And this poem was recited at her sister's wedding. She was beautiful. That was where she first met her husband. And her husband was a lot older than she was. And at least from the book, The Lady in Gold, it was thought that he was very in love with her, this young, beautiful girl, a lot younger than himself. She was not as in love with him, but they were married until her death. During their marriage, she has her portrait, and one of the questions, did she hire this portrait done? Did he hire this portrait done? But she has a portrait done by Gustav Klimt. So Klimt at that time, and this is a portrait of Klimt by Egon Schiele, and I liked this better than a regular portrait because it just has his personality. He was raised in an extremely poor family. His father was a gold engraver, but not at all wealthy or successful doing it. The family was always struggling financially. He and his brother were both very talented in the arts and successful very, very young and early, and got some public commissions and made money, and they were ending up supporting their family. Klimt ends up leaving, and once he had a lot of money, he started becoming more adventurous in his artwork. And here's one of the pieces that he did, and this is part of the Beethoven frieze, and it was actually supposed to be a temporary piece, but it was preserved. That was celebrating the work of Beethoven. This piece was accepted. He started becoming more and more adventurous in his work, and he ended up having some pieces that were not accepted, and he started what was called the Viennese Secession. So if you've studied art history, it's an important movement within art history and how art changes. And by that time, he had enough money to be able to do so, and he ended up making his own statement and making his money after that from doing portraits of rich people, and then allowing himself more freedom in his artistic endeavors. And so one of the lines of the Viennese Secession, to every age it's art, to every art it's freedom. He got a commission during that time to do a series of murals for the university. And he started on them with this new idea of exploring ideas and purposes that may not be officially sanctioned. And so people saw this and they felt like there was too much nudity and it was grotesque, and it was rejected. So he decided to stand by his art. He wasn't going to change it. And he had already taken money for this commission. And they were going to work out some sort of a compromise with him, but he was not in the mood to compromise. He said no. And an industrialist named August Leder ended up being a supporter of Klimt and buying him out of his commission and actually taking the paintings himself. And so that he was freed from the commission, he could do what he wanted to do, and with the support of a very wealthy industrialist. During this time, he paints Adela's portrait. This portrait took several years to paint, and people wondered about that. You know, why was she going to Klimt's studio frequently over several years? Does that really take 4 years for her to sit for? There were lots of preparatory drawings, so, you know, here's one. But there certainly is some speculation about what was going on, especially knowing that she was married to an older man, and Klimt was known as a womanizer. He never married, but it's thought he had up to 14 illegitimate children living in different places. So, who knows? But there's the portrait. 5 years later, she had this one done. Very different style. She ended up dying before the Holocaust, died very young of meningitis. And her husband was heartbroken. He never married again. And he kept these paintings in a room as really a memorial to his wife, and lived alone. They had tried to have children. She had several stillbirths, and then a baby that lived for just a couple of days. And so that huge heartache of not being able to have children, where her sister had this large family. Klimt goes on to paint. He actually vacations with the wealthy people that are supporting him, and he paints these beautiful pictures of the Austrian countryside. So that gets us to another family, Serena and August Leder. And they're the ones that end up buying out Klimt, buying out the friezes that he was doing for the university. And this is Serena, and painted by Klimt. She was actually a Pulitzer, so related to the Pulitzers. And their daughter. And we're going to find out a little bit later what happens to these paintings and to these people. Another important family, Zuckerkandl. Berta, and Klimt did paint her painting, and I don't have a picture of it. She was a journalist, a writer. She was a very active woman. She was married to Emil, who was a professor at the University of Vienna. She held a very influential salon where people would come and discuss ideas and talk about art. And her sister-in-law, and this is a melee. And this painting was never finished. Klimt died. It's thought that it was going to be covered in gold too, much like Adela's, never was. Amelia was divorced, and I don't know what the situation was, but Ferdinand, Adela's husband, supported her, and he ended up with the portrait, and he kept this portrait in his house as well as the one of his wife, and it was in his possession when the Nazis come. So in 1938, you have the unification of Austria and Germany, with Hitler arriving in March. So what happened? March 12th, the Germans enter Austria. The 30th, the Jews were required to report all their assets. November 9th, you have the Night of the Broken Glass. And through that, Hitler decides that he wants to build a cultural center in Linz. And Hitler was Austrian, so that idea of uniting Austria and Germany was very important to him. And he decides that he's going to house the treasures of the world in this center that would be in his hometown of Linz. And so he makes plans to build this museum. So as possessions were looted, they were divided. This goes to Hitler's collection for Linz, this goes to the private homes of the generals, and this goes into another holding. And so there was a whole art commission that would go through and start dividing up the stuff that was looted from different families and different businesses. Families tried to ship possessions, they were often broken into. And at this point, and this is going to come into the story a little bit later, if a Jewish person was not excited about giving away their possessions to the Nazis, they were taken to Dachau, and they were basically tortured there. And they were never intended to be killed. The point was to take their stuff. And so they were kept there until they reached a point of negotiation where they were willing to give away their businesses. And one of the people, Rothschild, he actually tried to leave the night that Hitler was coming in, and he was arrested at the airport. He went home, and there is a story that then the Nazis came to get him at his house after his arrest. I don't know how he got home. And his housekeeper said, no, he's eating dinner right now. And the Nazis waited. You know, they had so much respect for him because he was so wealthy. I don't know if that's anecdotal or not. But he spent a year in prison as his belongings were extorted from him. This piece is just one example, and it's now in Boston. And that's one of the questions, is how did all this stuff get to the U.S.? People fled to the U.S., they donated then their belongings once they were restored to U.S. museums, so a lot of the stuff is in the U.S. But it was originally intended for Hitler's own cultural center in Linz that would have a nice French gallery with all the stuff. So what happened to this painting? And of course, that's one of the more famous ones. Here it is in their home. After Adela's death, Ferdinand keeping it here. Ferdinand fled. He went to Switzerland. He had Czech citizenship, and I'm not exactly sure, that's another one of my questions, is like, when did he do that and why? But he fled to Switzerland and escaped, but he fled with nothing. And he left his home and his possessions in the care of a lawyer, Erich Furr. And this lawyer was hired to take care of other people's possessions at the same time, such as the letters and the Rothschilds and Freud's sisters, who ended up dying in a concentration camp, I think in Auschwitz. Well, it turned out this guy was a double agent. So he was hired to care for possessions as he was actually alerting the Nazis to the possessions that were in the house. So in January, March, so we were looking like 9 months after Hitler first had come into Austria. The collectors come to take Ferdinand Adele's art, and at that point, they take a Rodin that they owned, they took anything that was of traditional German character, and they took the porcelain and the values, but they left the portrait. They weren't interested in it. It's that whole idea of what an object means. And, what did it mean to Adela, if she really was in love with Klimt? What did it mean to her husband? And what did it mean to the Nazis then? And then what does it mean now? Furr liked this one, so he just kept that for himself, so. Then you get this really interesting guy. Oh, now I forgot how to say it. Ukiski? This guy is Klimt's illegitimate son. And he was raised very poor by a washerwoman that Klimt had an affair with. And I see him, and again, this is my interpretation of one of these angry young men that didn't get what he deserved in life and saw joining a Nazi as a way to get it. He was a filmmaker and an artist and rose within the ranks of the Nazi regime. So with his power as a Nazi, he decided to start collecting his father's stuff, which is really interesting. He really didn't know his father and didn't have a relation. This is one piece that he purchased, and it had been the letters, and he bought it from whoever Nazis had taken it. He wanted this one. And this one was owned by the Belvedere Museum in Austria. And so he couldn't get it. So he worked out a deal with this lawyer, double agent guy, and said, hey, how about if we give the museum this picture of the apple tree, and we give them this picture of Adela, And I take then the landscape that I want. And Führer said, sure. And that was how Adela ended up in the museum. But she couldn't be identified because she was Jewish. And it was such a beautiful painting. So she became the Lady in Gold and lost her identity and instead became a beautiful Klimt painting. In 1943, the Nazis sponsor a show, and they show all these works from Klimt. Klimt, of course, is not Jewish, you know, he's good German. So then you get Maria Altmann. So Maria was Teresa's daughter. She was a niece of this Ferdinand Adela. And she escapes in very harrowing circumstances. She had married when she was a young, wealthy woman and had the advantages, an heir to a textile industry. And the brother, her brother-in-law, had most of the assets of the industry. Her husband was an aspiring opera singer and was just living off of the family wealth. She was madly in love with him. He was also a womanizer, but she didn't care. She was in love with this guy. So they got married. The brother-in-law paid for a wonderful honeymoon for them in Paris. They came back. He had set up an apartment for them. And with a brand new car, they lived in it about 10 days and the Nazis came and took their car, and a Nazi started living with them as their keeper. Pretty soon her husband Fritz was taken off to Dachau and was again tortured, worked in hard labor, and trying to get his brother's assets. And the whole time his brother was out of Germany trying to negotiate for the release of his family members. He ends up being released. His brother worked out a deal. They lived at home for a short time, and then his brother arranges for their escape. And so they fly to Cologne, and they end up having this harrowing trip where they make it out of Germany. One of the people that held them ended up being killed by the Nazis for helping people escape. And they ended up making it to the US with basically nothing. She was given a cashmere sweater by her brother-in-law, said, see what you can do with this. And she started selling clothes in California, had a dress shop, and was successful as a middle-class woman. She had, and this is actually in the movie, it is in The Lady of Gold too, that she inherited the necklace that Adela wore in this. And that was one of the things when the Nazis came to their house, she had to give over the necklace. And it was thought later to be seen worn, and I think it was by Goering's wife, one of the Nazis. Yeah, Hermann Goering in my notes. The jeweler, so they called a jeweler and said, you've got to bring the jewelry. And the jeweler said, are you sure? And they said, yeah, you've got to bring it. So they brought it, the jeweler brought it to the house. The jeweler kept 2 earrings and didn't tell anybody. And when they escaped, the jeweler came and said, you may need these. And she hid them in her underwear, and they used those earrings for money to escape. Then you have... then you have this picture. I'm trying to think of when I am going to just go ahead and tell you what happened to it. So this ends up being one of the pieces that the Belvedere owns. Later, Maria Altmann, of course, with Lady in Gold, meets Randy Schoenberg, and they fight and win Austria, and they get those pictures restituted to themselves. This is one. The picture of the Lady in Gold ended up selling at Christie's for $135 million. This picture sold, I hope, to Oprah Winfrey for $87.9 million in 2006. In 2016, she sold it for $150 million to a Chinese collector. I mean, these numbers just boggle my mind. I mean, it's just like, I can't even, like, so I have to read them. Like, I couldn't even memorize them.
Just awesome.
This one sold for $33 million. And it was another one of these pictures that were restituted to the Bloch-Bauers. This one for about $40 million. This is Christie's auction house. $40 million. Okay, what happened to the letters? Auguste died before the war, before Hitler. His wife ended up escaping and then dying 3 or 4 years after her escape. She didn't live long. The daughter was married to a baron, a friend of her brother's. And he was not Jewish. She converted to Catholicism to marry him and was fine doing that. They had a very happy life. Hitler comes, he divorces her and joins the Nazis. And she is left in the house with a young son who is very ill. And so when other people are encouraging her to leave, she does not because of her son, and the son ends up dying. She then, her mother, to save her daughter's life, goes to the Nazis and proves through a court case that she was not her father's daughter. She was actually Klimt's daughter. And and they end up proving this, and that saves her life where she can stay in her home. Whether that's true or not, who knows? I mean, people were desperate to save their lives.
Do you have any clue as to why all the people in the background seem to be Asian or Japanese or?
I just have a guess, and that's because that becomes the style at the time. If you even look at U.S. pictures at the time, there's this fascination with Japanese. And so it becomes a style. And I don't know for sure if that's why.
Yeah, that was a signature of the modernists. And that's why a lot of this art was branded Untitled Kunst, because they liked a lot of non-Western civilizations,
Right.
African, French Polynesia. With
Right.
So that's, everybody sees influences.
An aspect of exoticism, Orientalism.
Right, exactly. Even if you look at the dresses of the first ladies in the White House, during that time, they're wearing very Japanese style. It becomes the thing. This particular piece is part of the Beethoven frieze that Auguste later had purchased this from the Viennese authorities so that it was in his personal possession. Elizabeth's ex-husband ended up alerting the Nazis that they had all of this stuff in their house, and the Nazis came and took it. This piece ends up surviving. This one and these did not. They were hid in this castle, and then the Nazis, to safeguard them against, once the Nazis knew they were going to lose and the Allies were coming in, they were hid here to be safeguarded. They ended up being intentionally blown up probably by the Germans in a drunken orgy right before the Allies come. And so many of the Klimts were lost. For some reason, the Beethoven frieze was not, and it was found later on in a castle that had been bombed by the Allies but was in a puddle of water in very bad condition. It ended up being taken back to the Belvedere, and Eric Letters, the son of Serena and Auguste, he was out of the country in Switzerland, I think, and he was trying to get it out of the country. Austria would not let it leave, but then they charged him for storage of it. So it's like, go figure. Berta. She escaped on a banana boat, but then she died in 1945. She also did the same thing trying to save her grandson, and she went to a friend and said, could you verify that you were this son's father? And the friend said, sure, to save his life. The grandson ends up becoming an important molecular evolutionist, and so very important in the scientific field. This piece was part of the lawsuit that Randall Schoenberg brought against Austria, and other family members claimed it, and so it is still in Austria and it's still in dispute. And I do have in the PowerPoint a whole video about that piece, but we're not going to look at it. I could actually.
Is it in Austria? Is it like on display or hidden or?
No, I think it's on display in the Belvedere. I think, but I'm not. I need to go to Vienna and just see what's there. I don't know. What can I say? Words. Uncommonly prolific acquisition policy. What happened to the art could be something that, maybe this is the topic of another presentation later on. So I'm going to look just very quickly at some of the other places. Part of it went to the Führer's Reserve, including the Rothschilds, Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds collection is the one that had the masterpieces, the Van Eycks and the Rembrandts, and the 42 crates of artifacts. You go into Poland. They tried to ship their works to Italy, and the Pope rejected them because they were too politically charged. They got some to Canada. General Frank ended up collecting a lot of the stuff for himself, and his wife was seen in the ghettos trying to purchase stuff from Jewish people that were fleeing. Some stuff was melted down, some stuff was kept. This is one that's currently in Vienna. It's a Bruegel that $77 million is what this is valued at. These two paintings were lost, for a long time discovered like in 2012, 2013. And so there's still paintings that are out there that Nazis have taken that people are still looking for. One of them, let me find, it's in my notes, I'll find, where did they find them? I will have to look that where they actually found it. It was, and I don't know. But I do know because I know I read it, but now I can't remember. These two paintings, when General Frank was fleeing the Allies, there were certain paintings that he had with him. And I think that these were two that he had with him. But then what happened to them, I don't know. They were considered to be lost, and now they've been found. But I'll find that as soon as I can look at my notes right in here. Yeah. Maybe I have it right here. No. This is another one that's France. France is a whole different story. Here's pictures of them trying to preserve the Nike of Samothrace, taking it down the stairs. They did, it's back on the Louvre. A really wonderful book that is just images of the work in France that was stolen and melted down for ammunitions. And so this book is in French, but these beautiful pictures, sadly, of the work that was destroyed. And then if you've, Monuments Men, the whole, the Ghent altarpiece, that then Czechoslovakia. And all of these, as you have seen the Monuments Men, was hidden in the salt mines. The Bruges Madonna, the Vermeer's artist in his studio, all of these things that the Nazis collected out of museums, most of them intended for Linz. So they were going to be in Hitler's collection of European art. And hidden there once they knew that the Allies were coming, and also hidden from the Russians. In Monuments Men, you've got this race between the Allies and the Russians to be able to get to these paintings. Most likely intended to be blown up by the Nazis, thinking if we can't have them, nobody can. And then that was thwarted. And many of these have been restored to their location before. And there's a picture of the salt mines. When American soldiers caught up with Goering, he was fleeing with baggage. And the whole degenerate art thing. This is Kokoschka, who fled, and when he was in London, continued to paint in the degenerate style. But this is looking at the Anschluss, and so looking at what happened to his beloved Austria in flames behind. So I kind of rushed through the rest of Europe because I wanted to talk about Texas, because this is kind of an interesting story. Has anybody read this book? The Treasure Hunt. And I do have it on the resources book if they're back there. Here's a monastery in Quedlinburg. And this monastery had treasures from the time of Charlemagne. And these are gold encrusted gospels that from the 800s that had been a treasure that had been cherished by this community and this church. And by the time of World War II, this church was a Lutheran church, because Germany, of course, had been part of the Protestant Reformation, but the Lutheran church and the town itself had kept these treasures. When the Nazis were there, the church had hidden them. And then when the Nazis were defeated, they were worried about the Russians coming and taking them, and they hid them in a cave outside the village and outside the church. And they asked the U.S. allies to come in and show them. It was actually just a villager that alerted the U.S. Army and said, "Can you guard this cave?" And so the U.S. Army set up a detail guarding the cave. Part of the detail that was supposed to guard the cave was a man who was a known kleptomaniac. And his mother was an art teacher, he had been an art teacher, and he ended up shipping these, like going to the post office and shipping these back to Texas. Pardon? To his home address. Yeah. I mean, it's just crazy. And it just blows my mind.
Was it that he was so out in the open with it that they didn't suspect anything?
I don't know. And he ships it to this little town that's like north of Dallas. And then he kept them, and there's reliquaries. I mean, and he keeps them there his entire life. He is a closeted gay man, and in his life, in his job, he's very conservative. He's taking care of his parents, he's growing orchids, and then he'll go to Dallas and he will have parties and be out in the open with his own lifestyle. he would have this work carried with him when he went to Dallas. And then he would bring it out at the parties and show people. And then he would pack it back up and take it back home with him to his hometown. His name is Joe Tom Meander. He died of cancer in 1980. And his brother and sister inherited the stuff, figured out it was valuable, and started trying to market it. So they end up selling it, and this is where I do need my notes again to make sure. Do I have it in here? They sell one of the Gospels for $11.7 million. And that's one of the questions that actually somebody asked me last night at the dinner.
Did they go through Christie's?
Yeah. How can they do that? How can you take stolen goods, or they might have gone by through Sotheby's, I don't know. How can you take stolen goods and make money off of it? Well, a New York Times reporter gets a hint of this and he starts chasing them down. They did have legal proceedings against them really up until their death, but both civil and criminal charges. But in the end, they sell more of it and they get a $3 million finder's fee. At one point, the U.S. government comes after them for like $40 million in taxes, but they end up paying $100 and some thousand. And they really, as far as I know, the family, I don't know where the money is. If the family has the money, what ended up happening with it. But the treasures are back in Germany now. So they are returned. But with this stuff marketed through official sanctions of the U.S. art market, which is one of the points of this book, is like there needs to be reform in the art market and how we look at provenance. Before the treasures went back to Germany, they were shown at the Dallas Museum of Art. And then actually this morning as I was going through this, I was thinking, I have a friend who used to work there, and I emailed her and I said, did you work there during this time? She goes, no, I didn't, but I have a friend that does. I'll put him in contact with you. So I may find out more about what the Dallas Museum of Art did and how they made money off of showing these treasures. Of course, people are interested in them. It's one of those questions that has two right answers. Do these belong to the public? Should they be shown? These are the treasures of the world. Do they belong to individual people who should be making millions off of them? I don't know.
Is that Paul?
Yeah, and it's a sacred comb that was used when you would install a bishop, that he would be combing out evil, so it was part of a sacred ceremony. So, what's an object worth? And what does it mean? And thank you very much.